In 1892, Alva Vanderbilt stood inside her newly completed summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. 50 rooms, $11 million. $7 million spent on marble alone. She called it Marble House, her temple to the arts. But on November 6, 1895, 3 years after the mansion opened, the temple witnessed something that had nothing to do with art. A transaction. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Alva's 18-year-old daughter, married the 9th Duke of Marlborough at St. Thomas Church in Manhattan. 300 police officers controlled the crowd. Thousands of spectators pushed against barricades, desperate to glimpse the bride. Inside the church, Consuelo stood at the altar and wept behind her veil. Not tears of joy, tears of surrender. The Duke had his heiress, Alva had her duchess, and Consuelo had learned what wealth actually buys. Not freedom, a cage. The marble that made Marble House magnificent was the same marble that made escape impossible. Before we explore how Marble House became Consuelo's prison, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're fascinated by the dark stories behind America's grandest estates, subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation into wealth, power, and the people who paid the price. Now, let's begin with the woman who built the cage. Alva Erskine Smith was born in Mobile, Alabama, on January 17, 1853, into a family that had money but not position. By the time she died in Paris, 80 years later, she had conquered New York society, divorced a Vanderbilt, married off her daughter to a duke, and funded the suffrage movement that won women the vote. But first, she had to teach herself how to weaponize wealth. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, was a commission merchant. The family had means. They summered in Newport. They traveled to Europe. But when the Civil War disrupted Southern commerce, the Smiths relocated to New York City in 1859, then to Paris, where Alva attended private boarding school in Neuilly-sur-Seine. The family returned to New York after the war. In 1871, Alva's mother, Phoebe, died unexpectedly. Murray's business declined sharply. By 1875, when Alva's father died, the family was in dire financial straits. Alva and her 3 sisters needed to marry fast. At a party for one of William Henry Vanderbilt's daughters, Alva's best friend Consuelo Iznaga introduced her to William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. On April 20, 1875, they married at Calvary Church in New York City. Alva had secured exactly what she needed: access to the largest fortune in America. But the Vanderbilts had a problem. They were excluded from New York society. Mrs. Caroline Astor, arbiter of the 400, considered them new money, vulgar, unacceptable. Alva understood something other wealthy women didn't. Social success required visibility. She cultivated relationships with journalists. She understood that newspapers and photography were weapons, and she was very good at using weapons. Between 1878 and 1882, Alva worked with architect Richard Morris Hunt to design a French Renaissance chateau at 665th Avenue in Manhattan. The Petit Chateau. Nothing petit about it. The house occupied an entire city block. In 1883, Alva threw a masquerade ball for 1,000 guests. $3 million in 1883 money, the event of the social season. Everyone wanted an invitation, including Mrs. Astor's daughter, but Mrs. Astor herself had never called on Alva, which meant Alva couldn't invite her. The rules were very clear. Mrs. Astor broke. She called on Alva. She and her daughter attended the ball. Alva had forced the Queen of New York society to bow. Mrs. Astor conceded to reporters, __. Quote _0 __. Alva had won. The Vanderbilts were now society, and Alva was the one who made it happen. In 1886, after William inherited $65 million from his father's estate, Alva commissioned a yacht, the Alva, $500,000. She sailed with William on extended voyages, but William spent much of his time with women who weren't Alva. Everyone knew, everyone pretended not to know. That was the arrangement wealthy women accepted. Tolerate your husband's affairs. Enjoy your coddled life. Keep quiet. Alva refused. By 1888, she had set her sights on Newport. She wanted a summer cottage that would surpass anything that had been built there. She hired Richard Morris Hunt again. William agreed to fund it as a 39th birthday present. Money was no object. Alva wanted perfection. In 1888, construction on Marble House began. Alva already knew who would live inside it. March 2nd, 1877. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born into a world of silk and steel. The silk was everywhere. In her nursery, her dresses, the upholstery of her mother's carriages. The steel came later, literally. Consuelo was named after her mother's best friend. Consuelo is Naga, a half-Cuban socialite who had married an English viscount. Alva believed this was the right path for her daughter, too. A title, international prestige, elevation above all other American families. From the moment Consuelo was born, Alva began preparing the product for sale. The education started early. Consuelo was tutored at home. By age 8, she could read and write English, French, and German fluently. Every Saturday, Alva forced her to recite endless poems in all 3 languages. Alva constantly supervised. Consuelo was never allowed to escape her mother's presence. No swimming, no tennis, no golf. The only recreation permitted was a weekly dancing class with Mr. Dodsworth, an elderly instructor who had taught generations of New York society children how to move properly. But the real torture was physical. Alva believed perfect posture was essential for a future duchess. During Consuelo's lessons, she was forced to wear a steel contraption that ran down her spine. It fastened at the waist and over the shoulders. The rod made writing nearly impossible. Consuelo had to hold her books high to read. The device was excruciating. Alva didn't care. Posture mattered more than comfort. When Consuelo committed any infraction, Alva beat her with a riding crop. The slightest disobedience brought the whip. When teenage Consuelo objected to clothing her mother had selected, Alva told her, quote one, "This was not parenting. This was product development." By 1894, when Consuelo turned 17, Alva took her to Europe for her social debut. The result was immediate. Consuelo had grown into a beauty. Visitors described her piquant oval face perched upon a long, slender neck, enormous dark eyes fringed with curling lashes, dimples, tiny teeth when she smiled. The playwright Sir James Barrie later wrote that he would stand all day in the street to see Consuelo Marlborough get into her carriage. Consuelo also had intelligence. By age 18, she had passed entrance examinations for both Oxford and Cambridge. She spoke 3 languages. She had been educated by the finest tutors money could hire. She was accomplished, obedient, and trained to accept whatever Alva decided. At least 5 men proposed marriage. Alva rejected them all, including Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg, 4th son of Prince Alexander of Hesse. Too minor a title. Alva wanted the highest-ranking aristocrat possible, a duke, and she already knew which one. By 1894, Consuelo had been transformed into exactly what Alva intended: beautiful, accomplished, fluent in 3 languages, trained to obey without question. The perfect product for the international marriage market. Alva already knew who she wanted to buy her. Newport, Rhode Island, 1888. While Consuelo learned to stand perfectly straight under threat of the riding crop, Richard Morris Hunt was designing her mother's monument to perfection. Marble House, 50 rooms, $11 million. A temple to the arts, Alva called it. The largest private expenditure on a summer cottage in American history. Hunt drew inspiration from the Petit Trianon at Versailles. Beaux-Arts style. White Westchester marble for the exterior. The load-bearing walls were brick, but everything visible was marble. 500,000 cubic feet of it. The house was U-shaped, spread over 4 levels, though it appeared to be only 2 stories. The kitchen and service areas occupied the basement, reception rooms on the ground floor, bedrooms on the 2nd floor. Servant quarters on the hidden uppermost level. 36 servants were required to operate the house. Construction took 4 years, 1888 to 1892. Hunt hired Giuseppe Moretti to produce the marble friezes and statuary. Allard and Sons handled interior design. The original fabrics were made by Prell, Every detail referenced European palaces. Hunt was creating not just a house, but a statement. American wealth could match European grandeur. The Grand Salon served as ballroom and reception room, Louis XIV style, green silk cut velvet upholstery and draperies. The walls were carved wood and gold-gilt panels depicting scenes from classical mythology, inspired by panels adorning the Galerie d'Apollon at the Louvre. The ceiling featured an 18th-century French painting in the manner of Pietro da Cortona, depicting Minerva, with a surround adapted from the ceiling of the Queen's bedroom at Versailles. The dining room used pink Numidian marble and gilt bronze capitals. The fireplace was a replica of the one in the Salon d'Hercule at Versailles. 12 freestanding rose alabaster Corinthian columns, 2 Baccarat crystal chandeliers, but the room that mattered most was the Gothic room, designed in Gothic Revival style to display Alva's collection of medieval and Renaissance decorative objects. The stone fireplace was copied from the Jacques Coeur house in Bourges, France. The room was dark, heavy, oppressive. This was where the Duke of Marlborough would propose to Consuelo 3 years later. The temple front portico resembled the White House, but this was privately owned. When Marble House opened in August 1892, it was described as unparalleled in opulence for an American house. The mansion transformed Newport from a relaxed summer colony of wooden houses to a resort of stone palaces. Every other wealthy family now had to compete with what Alva had built. She had created her masterpiece, 50 rooms on 4.4 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, $7 million worth of marble, a monument to art, culture, and refinement. Marble House opened in August 1892. Alva had built the grandest cottage in Newport. But William had been spending his time on the yacht Alva with women who weren't Alva. The marble temple was finished. The marriage was ending. And Alva was about to teach everyone what happened when you betrayed her. March 1895. Alva Vanderbilt did something no woman of her social position had done in a generation. She divorced her husband. The grounds were adultery. William had been unfaithful for years. Some believed William had hired a woman to pretend to be his mistress so that Alva would have cause to divorce him. Either way, Alva was unhappy in the marriage and acutely aware of how precarious women's positions were when the men with power over them didn't protect them. Even Alva's own lawyer tried to deter her. New York society ladies were horrified. Divorce was rare among the elite, scandalous. But Alva didn't cower. She chastised them as the unhappy, hypocritical wives she believed them to be. She told them they were resigned to accepting their husbands' overt extramarital affairs as the price they paid for their coddled lives. Alva received a financial settlement in excess of $10 million, about $300 million in today's money. She kept Marble House outright. She retained custody of her 3 children, Consuelo, William Jr., and Harold Stirling. The divorce decree even granted her the right to remarry. But divorce, no matter how financially advantageous, was difficult to survive socially. Everyone knew Alva had also taken a lover, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. One of William's old friends, a wealthy summer neighbor in Newport. The scandal was enormous. Alva needed something spectacular to shore up her fragile social position during this fraught period. She needed to demonstrate that she still mattered, that she could still command respect, that her place in society was secure. The solution was obvious. Become the mother of a duchess. If Consuelo married one of the highest-ranking aristocrats in England, Alva would ascend to a position no divorce could touch. The mother of a duchess. International prestige. A connection to British nobility that would silence every critic. The timing was perfect. Alva's divorce was finalized in March 1895. Consuelo's marriage had to happen that same year. Before Alva remarried Oliver Belmont, before the scandal had time to harden into permanent social exile. The engagement and wedding were not just desirable, they were necessary. Alva also believed genuinely that she was empowering her daughter. After her unhappy marriage to William, Alva didn't believe love matches were possible. Better to marry for power, prestige, and a meaningful role. American wives of rich men were appendages, decoration, But an English duchess had influence, social position, charitable authority, a defined role in the community. This was how Alva justified what she was about to do. She wasn't destroying her daughter's happiness. She was giving her power. By summer 1895, Alva had her target, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. 23 years old, possessor of one of England's oldest titles. Owner of Blenheim Palace, one of England's grandest estates, and desperately, catastrophically broke. Charles Richard John Spencer-Churchill inherited the Dukedom of Marlborough in 1892 at age 20. He also inherited Blenheim Palace, 187 rooms, 300 years of history, and debts that would consume everything Consuelo brought him. Charles Spencer-Churchill was born in 1871 in Simla, India, educated at Winchester and Trinity College, Cambridge. He was called Sonny, not because of his disposition, but because of his courtesy title, Earl of Sunderland. His childhood was unhappy. When he was 12, his parents, the 8th Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, divorced. His father and uncle, Lord Randolph Churchill, were notorious philanderers. The scandal shaped Charles. He learned early that duty mattered more than feeling, that titles required sacrifice. Those who knew Charles described him as surly, critical, suspicious, without intellectual qualities. Dandyish, cold, snobbish, image-obsessed. These were not the qualities of a man women fell in love with. But Charles wasn't looking for love. He was looking for money. Blenheim Palace had been built between 1705 and 1722 for John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, as reward for his military victories against France. The palace was monumental. Baroque architecture, 187 rooms, but maintaining it required enormous sums. By the late 19th century, the Marlborough family was nearly bankrupt. In 1880, Parliament passed the Blenheim Settled Estates Act, allowing the sale of precious books and art from the palace. It wasn't enough. When the 9th Duke inherited in 1892, drastic measures were required. Social mores prevented aristocrats from earning money through work. Charles had only one option: marry it. This was the era of the dollar princess. Rich American heiresses trading money for titles, impecunious British aristocrats selling their heritage for cash. The transactions were so common that the New York Times periodically printed lists of the sums changing hands. In 1895 alone, 9 American girls made such marriages. The matchmaking was systematic. Mary Stevens, Lady Paget. An American widow who had become an English hostess specialized in arranging these unions. In 1893, Alva met Lord and Lady Lansdowne, the Duke's aunt and uncle. They spent a weekend at Blenheim Palace. Alva set her sights on Charles immediately. Charles was desperate. He broke off a relationship with an Englishwoman he loved. He agreed to the arrangement. The price was $2.5 million in railroad stock. $91.6 million in today's money, 52 million pounds, plus an annual income of $100,000 for life for both Charles and Consuelo. Summer 1895. The Duke visited Marble House. Alva expected him to propose. The surly Duke made Alva wait. But finally, in the gloomy Gothic room at Marble House, surrounded by medieval artifacts and dark stone, Charles proposed to Consuelo. Alva had secured the Duke. The Duke had secured the money. Marble House would host the engagement announcement. There was only one problem. Consuelo was already engaged to someone else. Winthrop Rutherfurd was everything the Duke was not. American, handsome, part of old New York's 400. Impeccable pedigree, considered the handsomest bachelor in New York society. And Consuelo loved him. The engagement was secret. Rutherfurd and Consuelo planned to marry. By any standard except Alva's, it would have been a very good match, but Alva was determined that Consuelo would have a title. When Alva discovered the engagement, she unleashed a campaign of coercion that would break her daughter completely. Consuelo, for a brief moment, was brave. She confronted her mother. She demanded the right to choose her own husband. Years later, in her memoir, Consuelo wrote, _quote_2_ Alva's response was systematic destruction. Phase 1. Alva swept Consuelo to Europe to separate them. When Rutherford followed, Consuelo was forbidden to see him. Alva watched her daughter like a hawk. She intercepted Consuelo's mail. She refused to allow Rutherford into the house. She told Consuelo there was madness in the Rutherford family. She claimed he couldn't have children. All lies. Consuelo resisted. She threatened to elope. Phase 2. Alva locked Consuelo in her room at Marble House. The mansion that was supposed to be a temple to the arts became a literal prison. Alva threatened to have Rutherford murdered. She told Consuelo this explicitly. Murder! If Consuelo didn't submit, Alva would have the man she loved killed. Consuelo still refused. Phase 3. Alva took to her bed. She claimed that Consuelo's disobedience was literally killing her, that Consuelo's stubbornness was undermining her health, that she was at death's door. Alva appeared desperately ill, weak, dying. Consuelo, fearing her mother would die because of her, finally consented to marry the Duke. Alva made an astonishing recovery, immediately. As soon as Consuelo agreed, Alva's supposed illness vanished. She resumed her normal activities. The Death's Door performance had been exactly that, a performance. The engagement was announced. Alva leaked the news to the press. She fed journalists exhaustively detailed descriptions of everything. The trousseau, the pink lace corset with gold hooks, the silk stockings held up by diamond-encrusted garters. Alva was building public excitement, creating a spectacle, ensuring that the wedding would be an event so public that Consuelo couldn't escape, even if she wanted to. On the morning of November 6th, 1895, Consuelo wrote in her diary, Quote 3, Consuelo had surrendered. The Duke had his heiress. Alva had her duchess. And on November 6th, 1895, New York City would witness the most grotesque transaction in Gilded Age history, disguised as a wedding. November 6th, 1895. St. Thomas Church, Manhattan. 300 police officers lined the street. Thousands of spectators, mostly women, frantic to glimpse the bride. Inside, the cream of New York society filled the pews. Almost none of them were Vanderbilts. Alva had disinvited almost the entire Vanderbilt family. This was her day, her triumph. She didn't need them. William Kissam Vanderbilt was permitted to attend for one reason, to walk Consuelo down the aisle, to keep up appearances. As soon as he fulfilled that function, Alva insisted he leave the church immediately. Just an appearance. The press had been covering the wedding for weeks, excited anticipation from nearly everyone except the heartbroken bride. Alva had fed reporters every detail, not just the gown, the undergarments, the fastenings, the jewelry. Everything was publicity. Everything was performance. The Duke arrived late, last-minute negotiations to squeeze more from the Vanderbilt fortune. Charles Spencer-Churchill was determined to extract every possible dollar before committing to this transaction. Inside St. Thomas Church, Consuelo walked down the aisle. Behind her veil, she wept. The newspapers were informed. The weeping bride approached the altar like a lamb to the slaughter. 300 of New York's finest watched. They recognized the wedding for what it was, an especially prominent example of dollars for dukes, a craze among rich Americans for forging marital ties with titled but impecunious peers of the realm. The ceremony concluded. Consuelo and Charles were now Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. As they left the church and entered the carriage, Charles allegedly told Consuelo, Quote 4. The marriage began with a confession of contempt. William Kissam Vanderbilt built Sunderland House in Curzon Street, Mayfair, as a wedding gift for his daughter, a mansion just around the corner from the Dorchester Hotel. Consuelo would need somewhere to stay when she visited London. She would need it, because Blenheim Palace, her new home, was about to teach her what a cage actually felt like. Consuelo sailed for England 3 days later. She was leaving behind the marble cage of Marble House. She was arriving at something worse, a palace that made Marble House look modest, and a husband who had already told her he despised her. Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire, 187 rooms, no central heating, no hot water. From her bedroom window, Consuelo overlooked a pond in which a former butler had drowned himself. She wrote in her memoir, Quote 5, Consuelo had grown up in Marble House with heating and hot water. Modern American comforts. Blenheim had neither. The palace was cold, damp, built in the early 18th century with no consideration for human comfort. Designed for grandeur, not livability. English society was old-fashioned and overly restrictive. Despite Consuelo's wealth and beauty, the English upper class treated her poorly because she was American, new money, colonial. The damp English weather depressed a girl raised in New York, and Charles Spencer-Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, made very clear that he didn't want her. Every night, Consuelo was forced to join the Duke for dinner. Years later, she wrote, quote 6, the Dowager Duchess, Charles's mother, regularly interrogated Consuelo about whether she was in the family way yet. Producing an heir was Consuelo's only function. The questioning was relentless. Consuelo didn't understand aristocratic protocol. Once she asked the butler to light the fire in the drawing room. He was deeply shocked. That was the footman's job. The butler sent for the footman. Consuelo had violated servant hierarchy, another mark against the American Duchess. In 1897, Consuelo gave birth to a son, John. In 1898, Lord Ivor was born. She had produced the heir and the spare. The marriage had fulfilled its biological function, but the Duke had no interest in her beyond that. By the late 1890s, Charles began an affair with Gladys Deacon, another American beauty with little money, but great intellect. Marcel Proust wrote of Gladys, quote 7, Charles brought Gladys to Blenheim Palace. She and Consuelo became friends, even though Gladys was clearly the Duke's mistress. Consuelo was forced to maintain civility with the woman her husband loved instead of her. A few years into the marriage, Consuelo reconnected with Winthrop Rutherfurd. She spent 2 weeks with him in Paris. She had not forgotten the man she actually loved. When she returned to Blenheim, she told Charles she wanted to run away with Rutherfurd. Rutherfurd declined. He sent Consuelo back to her husband. Consuelo took other lovers, Reginald Fellows, Charles's cousin. Possibly Paul César Helot, the painter who did her portraits. Charles and Consuelo lived in the same palace but separate lives. One person became Consuelo's ally. Winston Churchill, Charles's cousin. Winston was the life and soul of the young, brilliant circle that gathered at Blenheim. He commiserated with Consuelo's unhappiness. When she and Charles decided to separate, Winston helped negotiate the terms. Despite her personal misery, Consuelo became beloved by the tenants at Blenheim. She helped them financially. She undertook philanthropic projects, mostly assisting mothers and children. She supported suffrage. She advocated for free school meals, free health care for children, national insurance for workers, and old-age pensions. She was politically liberal in an aristocratic world that was deeply conservative. But none of it made the marriage bearable. By 1906, Consuelo and the Duke lived in the same palace but separate lives. She had escaped the dinners. She had escaped his bed, but she had not escaped the marriage. That would take 15 more years, 1921. The Duke wanted to marry Gladys Deacon. To do that, he needed a divorce. After 25 years of marriage, 15 of them separated. Consuelo gave it to him. The divorce was granted in 1921. That same year, Charles married Gladys. Marcel Proust's description had been accurate. Gladys was beautiful, intelligent, charming, but the marriage was a disaster. Within years, Charles and Gladys became estranged. Gladys injected her face with paraffin wax, ruining her beauty. She became increasingly erratic. Eventually, Charles evicted her from Blenheim. She was forced into a lunatic asylum, where she died in 1977 at age 96. But in 1921, while Charles was marrying Gladys, Consuelo was marrying Jacques Balsan. Jacques Balsan was a French aviator, dashing, a pioneer of ballooning in airplanes, a colleague of the Wright brothers. He had fallen in love with Consuelo when she was an unattainable pawn in her mother's marital maneuvers. They had first met at Consuelo's coming-out ball 27 years earlier. Now, finally, they could marry. Consuelo described it in her memoir as a marriage of love. Finally, at age 44. But the Duke wanted more than a divorce. Charles had converted to Catholicism. The Catholic Church didn't allow divorce. He needed an annulment. In 1927, Charles asked for the marriage to be annulled by the Vatican. Under canon law, the only valid claim for annulment was being married against one's will. Alva was called to testify before an English tribunal of Catholic priests. She stated, without apparent embarrassment, quote 8, the annulment was granted on August 19, 1927. By this time, Alva and Consuelo were in a better place in their relationship. Alva helped facilitate the annulment. She told the truth. She admitted what she had done. Whether she regretted it is unclear, but she testified honestly about the coercion, the threats, the absolute power she had wielded. Alva had spent the years after Oliver Belmont's death in 1908 transforming herself. She moved to France to be near Consuelo. She bought a neighboring chateau. Mother and daughter enjoyed calmer, more intimate years together. The relationship was closer, easier. The damage from Consuelo's youth remained, but reconciliation was possible. Consuelo and Jacques lived a long and content relationship. They divided their time between France and Florida. When World War II began, they evacuated from France in 1940 and moved to the United States permanently. Consuelo had found love at 44, after a childhood of torture, a marriage of misery, and 25 years of waiting. Jacques Balsan gave her what Alva never had, the right to choose. 1908. Oliver Belmont died from complications of appendectomy. Alva was 55 years old, wealthy beyond measure and alone. The woman who had controlled every aspect of her daughter's life now turned that same ruthless determination toward a different target. Women's freedom. After 12 happy years with Oliver, Alva was devastated and eager to start a new chapter. She had been inspired by Consuelo's reform work in England and a close friend's joining the U.S. suffrage cause. Around 1908 and 1909, Alva attended her first suffrage meetings. She was initially enamored with the discussions. By 1909, she had joined the National American Woman Suffrage Association, but Alva soon doubted NAWSA's tactics. She wanted more militancy. She was inspired by Emmeline Pankhurst's aggressive tactics in England. Alva supported Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, leaders of the Congressional Union, which later became the National Woman's Party. Alva became the most important financial benefactor of the militant suffrage wing. She brought her experience from the 1909 to 1910 shirtwaist workers' strikes in New York, picket lines, arrests, direct action. In 1914, Alva commissioned the Chinese Tea House at Marble House. It was designed by Richard and Joseph Hunt, sons of the original architect Richard Morris Hunt. The Hunts traveled to China to research their design. The tea house was an exotic ornament for the property, but more importantly, it was a place to hold rallies for women's right to vote. Marble House transformed from Alva's temple to the arts into suffrage headquarters. She hosted conferences there, fundraising parties for votes for women. The mansion, built to display wealth, now hosted fights for women's rights. In December 1917, Alva chaired a mass meeting at Belasco Theater in Washington. Thousands attended. The meeting honored suffragists who had been arrested for picketing the White House and sent to Occoquan Workhouse, where they survived the Night of Terror. Alva awarded Jailed for Freedom pins to the imprisoned suffragists. In 1922, Alva and Alice Paul issued the Declaration of Principles. It demanded equality in all realms of life: education, professions, labor, church, sexual activity, jury duty, marriage, property, and citizenship. Equal pay for equal work. Women's right to control their own property and bodies. The right to divorce and gain custody of children. In 1929, the National Woman's Party purchased a house in Washington to serve as headquarters. It was dedicated to Alva Belmont. Today, it's known as the Sewall Belmont House National Historic Site. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. Alva had helped make it happen. She spent her final years in France, near Consuelo. In 1932, she suffered a stroke. She died in Paris on January 26, 1933. She was 80 years old. She left $100,000 to the National Woman's Party in her will. In 2016, President Barack Obama designated the Sewall Belmont House as the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Alva Belmont died in Paris on January 26, 1933. She was 80 years old. She had helped win women the vote, she had empowered a generation, and she had destroyed her daughter's youth. Both truths are permanent. 1919. Alva Belmont closed Marble House permanently. She relocated to France to be closer to Consuelo. The mansion that had been built as a temple to the arts, that had witnessed a daughter's torture and a wedding day's tears, sat empty. Alva divided her time between a Paris townhouse, a villa on the Riviera, and the Château d'Augerville, which she restored. In 1932, less than a year before her death, she sold Marble House to Frederick Prince. The Prince family carefully occupied the house during Newport's summer season for more than 30 years. They took special efforts to leave the vast majority of the interior intact, as the Vanderbilts had originally intended. To help preserve the integrity of Marble House's famed interiors, the Princes primarily resided in smaller quarters on the third floor, which had formerly been used for servant housing during the Vanderbilts' time. In July 1957, the famous Tiffany Ball was held at Marble House. Sponsored by Tiffany and Company, it was a benefit for the relatively new Preservation Society of Newport County. The ball welcomed internationally known guests, including Senator John F. Kennedy, E. Sheldon Whitehouse, the Astors, and Count Anthony and Countess Sylvia Sipari of the Vanderbilt family. The event continued late into the early morning hours. In 1963, the Preservation Society of Newport County purchased the house from the Prince Trust. Funding was provided by Harold Stirling Vanderbilt, Alva and William's youngest son. Through the Prince Trust, the Prince family donated virtually all original furniture for the house directly to the Preservation Society. The mansion was added to the National Register of Historic Places on September 10, 1971. The Department of the Interior designated it a National Historic Landmark on February 17, 2006. The Chinese Tea House, built in 1914 for suffrage rallies, was moved back from the edge of the eroding seaside cliffs in 1982. It underwent a major restoration. Today, it offers catered afternoon tea and dining through much of the year. Marble House is now open to the public as a museum run by the Newport Preservation Society. Marble House had survived, perfectly preserved, every room exactly as Alva intended. But what the house preserved was not just beauty. It was evidence of what wealth can buy and what it destroys. While Marble House sat empty, then occupied, then preserved, Consuelo was finally living in France with Jacques Balsan, the man who had loved her for 27 years before she was free to love him back. Consuelo and Jacques lived at Château Saint-Georges Motel near Fontainebleau, an idyllic existence. Winston Churchill and his wife Clementine were frequent visitors. The aging Alva Vanderbilt bought a neighboring chateau to be near her daughter. Reconciliation at last. After the 9th Duke died in 1934, Consuelo was once again welcome at Blenheim Palace as a guest of her son, the 10th Duke. When World War II began in 1940, the Balsans were evacuated from France at the onset of the Nazi invasion. They set up home at Casa Alva, south of Palm Beach, Florida. They also spent time at Sutton Place in New York City. Consuelo's childhood home, the Petit Chateau, had been demolished in 1927. She couldn't return there. In 1953, Consuelo published her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. She told her story in her own words: the abuse, the coercion, Alva's absolute power, the forced marriage, the misery at Blenheim, the eventual freedom. In 1956, her son Ivor died of a brain tumor. Less than 2 months later, Jacques died. Consuelo was widowed at 79, alone after a lifetime of forced company, then chosen company. She died on December 6, 1964, in Southampton, Long Island, New York. She was 87 years old. Consuelo chose to be buried near her younger son Ivor at St. Martin's Church in Bladon, Oxfordshire, not far from Blenheim Palace, not with the Vanderbilts, not in America, near the son she loved, in the shadow of the palace that had been her prison. Some historians suggest that Ivor may have been Winthrop Rutherfurd's biological son, conceived during Consuelo's Paris reunion with him. The timing of Ivor's birth in 1898 makes it possible. If true, Consuelo chose to be buried beside the child, born of the love she was forbidden to have. From age 18 to 44, Consuelo lived under control or in a loveless marriage. 26 years. From age 44 to 87, she was finally free. 43 years. Consuelo Vanderbilt died on December the 6th, 1964. She was 87 years old. She had been a duchess. She had been a philanthropist. She had been a suffrage supporter. She had been a mother. But she chose to be buried as a woman who loved her son, not as a Vanderbilt, not in America. Near Ivor, in the shadow of Blenheim. The palace that had been her prison became her final address. Marble House still stands at 596 Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. 50 rooms, $7 million worth of marble. A temple to the arts that became evidence of a crime. Visitors can tour the mansion today. They walk through the Grand Salon where Alva entertained New York society. They see the Gothic room where the Duke of Marlborough proposed to Consuelo. They admire the dining room, with its pink Numidian marble and gilt bronze capitals. They photograph the ceiling paintings, the carved wood panels, the baccarat chandeliers. What tourists see is the marble, the magnificence, the opulence. What tourists don't see is the steel spine rod, the riding crop, the locked bedroom door, the tears behind the wedding veil. Marble House is both an architectural masterpiece and the scene of systematic abuse. Alva Vanderbilt built a monument to beauty while destroying her daughter's youth. She fought for women's freedom after denying her daughter's choice. She became a suffrage hero while being her daughter's dictator. She helped win women the vote, the right to divorce, the right to control their own property and bodies. But first, she exercised absolute power over Consuelo. She forced her daughter to marry a man she didn't love. She threatened murder. She faked a fatal illness. She broke her daughter's will completely. Both truths are permanent. Alva empowered a generation of women. Alva destroyed her own daughter. The same woman did both. Marble House proves that wealth doesn't liberate. It can imprison. The mansion was built with $11 million in 1892, $313 million in today's money. That wealth didn't free Consuelo. It gave Alva the resources to cage her, the tutors who isolated her, the steel rod that tortured her, the surveillance that prevented escape, the wedding that was a transaction, all of it funded by Vanderbilt money. Consuelo's story is not unique. In 1895 alone, 9 American girls made similar marriages, dollars for dukes. The New York Times printed lists of the sums changing hands. The trafficking was systematic. Wealthy American families buying European titles, impoverished European aristocrats selling their heritage. Young women traded like property. Some of those marriages were happy, some weren't, but all of them were transactions. And Consuelo's was built on coercion that Alva herself later admitted. Quote 9. The Preservation Society of Newport County runs Marble House as a museum now. The Chinese tea house, built in 1914 for suffrage rallies, offers afternoon tea. The grounds overlook the Atlantic Ocean. The beauty remains, perfectly preserved. But preservation raises a question. We preserved the house. Do we preserve the truth of what happened inside it? When you tour Marble House, are you admiring art or a crime scene? The answer is both. The mansion is evidence of what was possible in the Gilded Age, of what American wealth could build, of how European aristocracy could be purchased, of how women could be controlled, of how power operated when money had no limits. Alva fought to give women power over their own lives after exercising absolute power over her daughter's life. The irony is permanent. The contradictions remain unresolved. We can admire Alva's suffrage work. We can condemn what she did to Consuelo. Both are true. Neither negates the other. Consuelo survived. She found love at 44. She lived 43 more years as a free woman. She published her memoir. She told the truth. She chose where to be buried. She had the final word, but the cost was 26 years, a childhood of torture, a wedding day of tears, 11 years of forced dinners with a man who despised her. 15 years of separation before. Divorce was possible. 6 more years before annulment freed her completely. The marble that made Marble House magnificent was the same marble that made escape impossible. That's what wealth does when it's used as a weapon. It builds prisons so beautiful that no one outside can see the bars.